What's as cheap as dirt and just about as common? That's right, the Avtomat Kalashnikova, the world's most produced assault rifle and the legendary Cold War rival to the American M16. The product of wartime innovations and the lessons learned from the terrible losses suffered by the Soviet Union, the AK would be developed by a once ostracized man with minimal experience in firearm design, and would catapult him to a hero of the nation that once shunned him. Ever since it first entered production over 75 years ago, the Kalashnikov has been found in the hands of anyone with an axe to grind with the West, from tin pot dictators in Africa to the tree-dwelling guerrillas of Vietnam, or the cave-dwelling Taliban in Afghanistan, owed in large part to its famed reliability, a connotation so widespread that people will often refer to anything reliable as the Kalashnikov of whatever the hell they're talking about. So how did Mikhail Kalashnikov become the legendary arms designer he's remembered as today? How did his rifle become so popular and gain its almost mythical status? And is the AK really a hero of the Soviet Union, or is its reputation more fiction than fact? The Kalashnikov's story begins on the frozen battlefields of the Eastern Front of the Second World War. Now, if you know anything about World War II, you know how absolutely horrific the Eastern Front of this war was. But I'm going to explain it anyway, so shut up and listen. The Eastern Front of World War II opens up in 1941, when Hitler pulls a sneaky one on Stalin and surprises everyone by invading the Soviet Union after the two had conquered Poland together. And when I say everyone, I mean just Stalin, because by this point, everyone else who had paid any attention to Hitler's actions in Europe since 1936 knew that A. Hitler wanted more territory, and B. his word is about as meaningful as a 12-year-old screaming about how he's fucked your various family members, and had been trying to warn Stalin, but he chose to ignore them. So anyways, Hitler invades the Soviet Union in June 1941. But soon runs into the age-old problem that has been encountered when anyone ever has invaded Russia. Russians. But more scarily, the Russian weather. The average temperature in Russia during the winter is somewhere between frostbite-inducing and instant hypothermia, and the Germans had failed to conquer the Soviets by winter and were now stuck in the freezing Russian weather. And here is where the Eastern Front begins to get fun. Well, actually, no, here's where it gets really shit. The Soviets had sort of gotten their act together, helped out by the American Lend-Lease program and the recent industrialization of much of the country, and had been able to slow the German advance enough that they would have to survive the harsh winter far from home, but more importantly, far from their supply lines. Though the Soviets weren't doing much better. You see, while the Soviets had an insane capacity to produce weapons and equipment for their soldiers, they were having a lot of problems getting those weapons and equipment to the front lines where they were needed. The lack of supplies for both the Germans and the Soviets, along with a deep hatred for each other on an existential level, would lead to some of the most brutal fighting experienced anywhere during the Second World War, and countless atrocities committed by both sides. From the front lines of this fighting would come a man with an idea, a man by the name of Mikhail Kalashnikov. Mikhail Kalashnikov himself is quite an interesting fella. Born in November 1919, Kalashnikov was brought into a country in a time of radical change, and a family unwittingly caught on the wrong side of that change. The 1918 Russian Revolution gave rise to the Communist Bolsheviks and their Soviet Union in one of the most notorious revolutions in human history. The Communists targeted those with wealth and land that were seen as the enemy of the workers, and Kalashnikov's family, a large peasant farming family, were branded as kulaks for owning land. During the brutal collectivization policies that began in 1928, Mikhail and his family were exiled to Siberia along with millions of other such families and those labeled enemies of the state, that were lucky enough to have not just straight up been killed. Or unfortunate enough to still be suffering if you swing that way philosophically. In 1932, Mikhail, at the age of 13, would manage to make his way back to his hometown, where he became a tractor mechanic, further igniting his long-held interest in machinery. As the Soviet Union ruthlessly industrialized under Stalin's 5-year plans, Kalashnikov was conscripted into the ever-expanding Soviet military as a Red Army tank mechanic in 1938, where his knack for developing machinery would cause him to rise to the rank of tank commander by the time World War II broke out. As the Germans marched on the Soviet Union, Kalashnikov and the rest of the 24th Tank Regiment mobilized to defend their homeland, seeing combat at the Battle of Bryansk, where Kalashnikov would be injured and hospitalized until April of 1942. It was in hospital that Kalashnikov overheard injured infantrymen's complaints about their issued rifles. At this time, the Soviet infantryman was mainly issued variants of the Mosin-Nagant M1891, namely the M1891/30, and that was if they were issued a weapon at all at this point in the war. And Kalashnikov, seeing an opportunity to both improve the lives of his fellow comrades and avoid being sent back to the front lines, began designing a new submachine gun, which, luckily for him, caught the attention of the Red Army's leadership, leading to him being assigned to the Red Army's Small Arms Development Program in late 1942. Here, Kalashnikov would continue to work on new small arms designs, being tasked in 1944 with developing a new rifle to fire the newly developed intermediate 7.62 by 39mm cartridge. And yes, 7.62 was considered intermediate at this time. This cartridge had been developed from captured German prototypes for a new kind of weapon, the assault rifle, the Soviets poring over field trial variants of the rifle that would become the STG-44, and developing the aforementioned ammunition, more commonly known by its Soviet military designation, the M43. Kalashnikov's first design would draw heavily from the operating principles of the M1 Garand, and was similar to prototypes of what would become the SKS, though nowhere near as successful, and Kalashnikov would abandon this first design by 1946, when he would submit the initial drawings for what he called the Avtomat Kalashnikova, literally Kalashnikov Automatic. Following the army greenlighting his project, Kalashnikov set about creating a weapon that was cheap, simple, and reliable, and having an appreciation for the advanced weapons the Soviets were capturing, opted to combine their innovations into his own design. With access to the likes of M1 Garands, STG-44s, FG-42s, and a plethora of Soviet prototypes, Kalashnikov's rifle began to take shape. It would incorporate a short-stroke gas piston system, as well as a tapered magazine similar to the one used on the STG-44, with the internals constructed to give maximum tolerance between the moving parts, and what resulted would be just what Kalashnikov had set out to create: a cheap, simple, and exceptionally reliable automatic rifle which became known as the AK-47. The rifle proved successful in trials with the Red Army, but one of Kalashnikov's colleagues suggested an alteration to the design to increase its reliability even further, changing the short-stroke gas piston to a long-stroke one, an alteration that Kalashnikov would integrate, along with combining the upper and lower receivers into one piece, and simplifying the fire selector and safety mechanisms. This design, known as the Avtomat Kalashnikova Overrated 1947, simplified to just AK-47, would be submitted to the Red Army in 1947, with trials beginning in 1948, the design proving itself as exceptionally reliable in a variety of conditions, as well as having serviceable accuracy, resulting in its adoption as the 7.62mm Kalashnikov rifle in 1949. Despite functioning well in testing, initial manufacturing of the Kalashnikov was rocky, with Soviet factories proving incapable of consistently producing the stamped receiver for the weapon, resulting in the creation of the Type II AK-47, with a milled receiver in 1951, with further refinements to the production methods for the rifle resulting in the subsequent Type 3 in 1955, and then the further improved Type 4 in 1959, which would become known as the AK-M. This version featured a lighter receiver and a slanted muzzle device to reduce muzzle climb in automatic fire as well. And while the design was undergoing major changes, there were some major changes occurring in the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin, after 29 years of uncontested domination over the Soviet Union, and presiding over the deaths of tens of millions throughout that time, died after suffering a stroke in 1953, killed in a brilliant stroke of irony, as he had killed or sent to the gulags all of the doctors capable of helping him recover. After a characteristically Russian series of events, Lavrenti Beria, head of the NKVD, also lay dead, and Nikita Khrushchev rose to power as the new General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the longest way of saying he was now in charge of the Eastern world, and the man to lead the Soviet people in opposing the West. And oppose the West he did, solidifying the Soviet satellite states into the Warsaw Pact in 1955 as an equivalent to NATO, and began shipping droves of Kalashnikov's new rifles to the Warsaw Pact nations. Khrushchev wasn't satisfied though, and began exporting the weapon to allies of the Soviet Union, namely China and North Korea, to equip their armies with the rugged symbol of Soviet military prowess as the Cold War expanded into the late 1950s and early 60s. But Khrushchev still wasn't satisfied, and felt the world still needed more communism, and thus more of Kalashnikov's cheap, reliable rifle, and started supplying them to any and all communist-aligned forces around the globe. Ever thought your capitalist society was failing to meet the needs of the people and wanted to enact some violent change? Do you think Western democracy has failed your country and needs a new kind of leadership? Has the United States meddled in your country's affairs just one too many times? Then Khrushchev would like to speak to you and will happily send you some Kalashnikov rifles to help get your movement started. While Khrushchev wouldn't last long in his position, his policy of shipping truckloads of Kalashnikovs to every corner of the globe would continue until the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, with the AK finding use in almost every armed conflict of the Cold War. But the rifle's popularity wouldn't end there. With the Soviet Union gone, and the new Russian nation being incredibly strapped for cash, military stockpiles became prime hubs for entrepreneurial Russians to make their fortunes, with illicit arms dealers taking over the business once run by the Soviets, and continuing to proliferate the rifle in nations embargoed by the West. So common is the rifle that it has become symbolic to the history of many nations, such as in Ireland and Mozambique, as a symbol of their struggles for independence, even adorning the flag of the latter. Though it has amassed a more nefarious reputation in places such as Mexico, where it has a strong connection to the drug cartels that terrorize the country. Its widespread symbolism isn't the only reason the weapon has gained such notoriety. It is also famed for its reliability to such a degree that referring to something as the Kalashnikov of X has become synonymous with exceptional reliability, and to all intents and purposes, it's an accurate assessment. The long-stroke gas piston of the Kalashnikov and the tolerances between the moving parts means that the chamber stays relatively clean due to less residue being forced into it by the gas system, and the relatively large gaps between the parts meaning that the weapon is less sensitive to dirt interfering with the rifle's operation. Therefore, the weapon is, in theory, less likely to jam and can fire reliably in most conditions. The validity of this reputation is illustrated perfectly in early American combat reports from Vietnam, with soldiers abandoning their famously unreliable M16s in favor of the rugged Russian rifle, though its famed reliability comes at the cost of its accuracy, and can vary dramatically between variants, especially those made by less quality-assured manufacturers. Hello, this is post-production and very tired Harold. A lot of what I just said was incorrect, and it's kind of important to what the fuck I'm talking about, so I'm gonna make a few quick notes. The long-stroke gas piston is theoretically more reliable because the system is simpler, and the greater mass of the piston itself creates more momentum and is more likely to fully extract, eject, and chamber a new round. And then the point about the Vietnam War is also largely untrue, just call that a bad source. While yes, some early American units are reported to have used AKs, this was only on covert operations that required them to be in the field for extended periods, thus making AK ammunition more abundant and easier to acquire, and it was never really a practice by the majority of GIs in country. And finally, a lot of the Kalashnikov's reliability comes from its durability when produced correctly, with the rifle in ideal condition, being able to withstand substantial external damage and still fire. Okay, corrections over. The AK-47 has been produced millions of times in its lifetime, and has given rise to an obscene amount of variants. Similar to the Glock, there are far too many for me to be able to do justice in one video, but I'll run you through the ones that you're most likely to encounter. The AK-47 itself only has a handful of variants, and only lasted a few years in production, those variants being the aforementioned Type 1, 2, and 3 designs. Along with these three early designs, the AK-47 and AK-SN would be produced, the former being a folding stock variant of the weapon, having a stock similar to the one found on the MP40. And the latter being a night sight equipped version of the weapon. The AKM, the most common variant of the weapon, would have similar variants, along with introducing the AKM-SU, a shortened barreled version of the weapon, and would be developed into a light machine gun that would become known as the RPK, which itself would have a plethora of variants that would mirror the AKM. These 7.62 chambered Kalashnikovs would be largely replaced by the 5.45x39mm chambered AK-74s in 1974, which again had similar variants to previous Kalashnikov rifles with folding stocks, shortened barrels, etc. The more modern Kalashnikov rifles, the 100 and 200 series, are just that. Modernized and updated variants of the Kalashnikov design fit for modern combat, featuring chamberings in the Kalashnikov's original chamberings, 7.62 and 5.45x39mm, as well as 5.56x45mm NATO. And on top of all of these variants attributed to Mikhail Kalashnikov and the Soviets are an untold number of foreign and homemade variants of the design that have cropped up everywhere the smell of revolution has wafted since 1947, most famously coming from China as the Type 56, and Israel as the Kalashnikov-derived Galil. In total, it's estimated that anywhere from 50 to 100 million of Kalashnikov's rifle have been produced since the 1940s, and have been found on every continent. Well, except for Antarctica, unless there's some penguins intent on seizing the means of production. The Kalashnikov rifle is truly timeless, and its tremendous impact can be quantified easily in the legacy of Mikhail Kalashnikov. Passing away in 2013, Kalashnikov is remembered as a hero to the Soviet and Russian people, the man that gave the East the ultimate weapon to oppose the West with, and there is now even a museum dedicated to him and his rifle, a far cry from the exiled enemy of the revolution he started life out as. He continued to develop weapons until his death, presiding over the majority of the improvements that were made to his design by the Soviets and then the Russian Federation post-1991 as a part of Kalashnikov concern. Kalashnikov himself was conflicted over his weapon, concerned for the carnage his invention had wrought on the world, famously emphasizing that he wanted to create a weapon for defense and not for offense, and asking the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church if he was responsible for those killed by his rifle just before he himself passed away. Kalashnikov's concern is a reminder of the realities of war and conflict, that while we can marvel and obsess over the weapons of war and their history, we shouldn't celebrate the destruction they cause to human life. The AK-47 is an icon of the military world, but its reach transcends its military applications, being recognizable to nearly anyone with even minute knowledge of current conflicts and world events. Its reputation is well deserved, and its reliability legendary, standing the test of time and continuing to be found in the hands of those opposing the West to this day. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. I really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed the video, and maybe learned something new. If you did, please like the video and subscribe for more content, and I'll see you in the next one.